Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I am Emily Brodsky from the University of California, Santa Cruz. I am also the chair of SZ4D, and I'm here to give you a brief overview of what is SZ4D and an introduction to our guiding document, which is the implementation plan. So let me start at the top. SZ4D, or Subduction Zones in 4 Dimensions, is a community-driven initiative for a long-term interdisciplinary research program to understand the limits and possibilities of predicting geohazards. I want to underscore there that it is community-driven. This is a real grassroots effort, and it is long-term. We can't really study geohazards without being committed to it for the long haul. The group utilizes subduction zones as the ideal natural laboratories for these efforts and works together to create a multifaceted infrastructure and other resources needed to enable new discoveries. SZ4D brings together a diverse community of scientists from a wide range of disciplines and backgrounds who study earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and surface processes, with the emphasis on the catastrophic nature of surface processes sometimes. Things like debris flows and related hazards. Okay, so that's a pretty broad mandate, and we need to put some flesh on those bones. And to do that, SZ4D was funded by the National Science Foundation of the United States to put together an implementation plan. And that came out in November 2022 after an extensive multi-year effort that included releasing a draft plan for an entire year beforehand, soliciting feedback from the community and iterating on those drafts. This is kind of a giant document. It has 185 pages, and so I don't expect that most of you have time to read it. And so what I'm going to try to do in this video is give you a short overview of some of the highlights of the document, and then hopefully inspire you to dig on in to look at it in more detail. So the implementation report is freely available on our webpage, and it articulates some obvious points. First, the importance of studying geohazards in subduction zones. Geohazards are clearly a societally important issue for us to engage on as earth scientists. And subduction zones are where the world's largest hazards converge. We don't study subduction zones just because we like subduction zones. We study them because societally they're incredibly important from a geohazard point of view. And also scientifically, subduction zones provide a really amazing natural laboratory, which is uniquely suited for creating the control conditions and systematic variables we need to look at subduction zones and actually identify processes. By going along strike of a subduction zone, we can look at how pressure temperature conditions evolve, how volcanoes evolve, how a system evolves in a way that is much more like a laboratory experiment than usually the Earth provides. And so we have some driving questions that we want to ask specifically at subduction zones about geohazards, and that subduction zones are uniquely suited to answer. When and where do large damaging earthquakes happen? How do transcrustal processes initiate eruptions and arc volcanoes? How do events within the Earth's atmosphere, hydrosphere, and solid Earth generate and transport sediments across subduction zone landscapes and seascapes? What fraction of a subduction zone's energy budget goes into building and shaping subduction zone land and seascapes? And how can we transform the mindset of our geoscience community to embrace education, outreach, accessibility, capacity building, diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice as critical components for the success of SZ4D and future scientific endeavors by the geosciences community? These are big questions. A big chunk of this document is devoted to breaking down those questions into smaller components that are tractable and answerable with specific observations or activities. I invite you to dig on in. The document is broken up into sections that really go with these bullet points. There's an earthquake section, which we call faulting and earthquake cycles, which breaks down the when and where do large damaging earthquakes. Similarly, there are sections that focus on these other questions, a magmatic section, a landscape and seascape section, a building equity and capacity section that try to break these questions down into tractable pieces. What else is in this document is an articulation of the power of an integrated geohazards approach. That power is both scientific and practical. Scientifically, as we look at all the different geohazards, there are some common themes that may even have some common answers. In all cases, we need to look at forecasting and prediction as part of what we want to know about the geohazards. In some cases, the answers may be that prediction may be possible, at least under certain circumstances. We know that volcanic eruptions sometimes are predictable. People do routinely predict volcanic eruptions in certain areas, but for other geohazards, we are really unsure whether prediction will ever be possible, and earthquakes are kind of the key example of that. And so there's a lot to be learned from each other about what is and is not possible in terms of prediction. And this is one of the key drivers of the whole SZ4D enterprise. There are other cross-cutting, overlapping scientific goals in terms of mass and energy balance. Everybody needs to know about rheology and stress, and there are common flow laws that need to be understood. In the system, fluids and fluid migrations literally cross-cut the whole system. Climate variability is a driver at the top of the whole system, and the triggering and cascading of hazards physically connects the volcanoes to the landslides, to the earthquakes, to the tsunamis. In addition to these integrated scientific needs and overlapping goals, there are practical overlapping needs, which we'll come back to in a little bit in this presentation. They're articulated well in section 5 of this document, that everybody needs some geological framework in order to study the hazards. Everybody needs to know how the ground moves. And these overlapping needs means that we can really be quite ambitious in our aspirations by efficiently reusing resources. So what needs to be done? The implementation report takes a traceability matrix approach. This is an approach inspired by NASA, which is an approach that NASA uses for their mission designs. And the idea is to set up a matrix where the rows are the various science questions broken down. The columns are what needs to be done to answer those questions, what needs to be done in terms of observations or maybe modeling activities, at what resolution, and what are the geographic constraints on those. And so by taking these traceability matrices together, we developed a set of notional experiments in this very systematic, deliberative way. And notional experiments that can address the science questions. These notional experiments boil down to what's in this cartoon, which includes a large set of instrumentation encapsulated in the arrays, MegaArray, VulcArray, and SurfArray, as well as a number of activities that wrap around the arrays in a way to enable us to actually create science understanding from the instrumental data. So let me walk through these a little bit. MegaArray schematically is an amphibious set of instrumentation, includes both seismometers and geodetic instrumentation, is designed to look at the relationship between coupling and various manifestations of fault movement through slow slip and fast slip, that is earthquakes, throughout an earthquake cycle, and to understand what the relationship is between locking and slip. And so that starts out with a very broad-based reconnaissance style, phase 2A, which then is meant to densify in phase 2B in areas of high strain gradient, to look at the relationship between slow and fast slip. VolcArray has two components. The sensor arrays, which are envisioned as going on something like 30 or more volcanoes over a 10-year telemeter deployment. And the idea here is to have consistent instrumentation in place before the eruption, so one can actually create context for the eruption, for background state on an eruption, through an eruption. And if we do this on enough volcanoes, we statistically are very likely to capture a full set of precursors, such as they are, through the eruptive process. In addition, this is to be supplemented by imaging arrays, which are much more intense instrumentation, specifically designed to image the magmatic system. SZ4D is a set of notional experiments to look at both bathymetry, topography, and as well as watershed instrumentation to look at the effects of environmental variables on the movement of sediment through the system. So I've so far described this kind of siloed vision of the arrays, and that has something to do with how we let the array design and the notional experiments sort of grow from the science questions that were based in individual hazards. But when you actually look at the dots on the map in these cartoons, you suddenly realize that they kind of all look alike. That there is a bunch of common instrumentation, certainly common telemetry, certainly common data infrastructure, and as we'll discuss in a moment, certainly common geological context that makes them much more efficient if they coexist. And this leads in section 5.2 of the implementation report to the concept of the multi-squared array. Multi-squared here is meant to denote multidisciplinary and multi-hazard array. It's where overlap matters. And so, although one certainly could envision separate arrays to talk about the volcanoes and talk about and learn about the earthquakes and learn about the landslides, those of you who are keeping track of the budget numbers suddenly realize that we're talking about this enormous effort. And yet we can, in fact, do it all if we're very efficient and clever about having an overlap and integrated array, which is what multi-squared array is. So I've been talking about the arrays here. Arrays, instruments are mere bits in the machine if we don't do the scientific work to create understanding from them. We have to analyze the data. We have to bring in other observations for context, field geology, and geophysical imaging, numerical modeling, lab experiments, and we need people. We need human beings to be scientists. We need to do training and outreach. And so we've In SZ4D, we use the term activities to refer to these things that are not the instrumental arrays, but are at least as important to create science. Drilling down a little bit on this, activities include field geology, geophysical imaging, and experiments and modeling. These kind of go together in a way because it really is almost a seamless connection between trying to develop a flow law in the lab and then going out and testing it in the field with geological observations and creating a quantitative framework for that test with modeling that they can apply it to geophysical observations as well. So up to now, I haven't said anything about where any of this is happening. We have notional experiments that are cartoons in space, and deliberately the process that created the implementation report started in this cartoon land and worked hard to keep it abstract as long as possible so that the key requirements for geography came out naturally from the science. And so ultimately, each of the groups involved in building the implementation report articulated their key requirements. We created an inventory of every single subduction zone around the world and systematically walked around them, not physically walked, intellectually walked around them, and figured out which ones match the key requirements, along with some geopolitical constraints in terms of safety and logistic viability of subduction zones. And as a result, we ended up with these recommendations in the implementation plan that we would have complementary domestic and international sites, with a focus very specifically on the Chilean margin. The group voted to, or polled that 70% of the instrumentation should end up in Chile, with complementary instrumentation in Cascadia and Alaska to fill in and port that information back to the domestic hazards. And so I should back up just a teeny bit here and point out that we are an NSF funded entity, SZ4D. We are obligated to address our domestic hazards. And so it might read as slightly peculiar that this report is recommending Chile as a focus site for instrumentation. But the logic here is that Chile has more events. It moves faster. It has more, commonly has more earthquakes. It has more eruptions. The sediment is moving. And so we can learn something faster within a scientist's lifetime and in time to bring that information back to Cascadia, ideally before a giant Cascadia earthquake happened. If we put that sort of instrumentation into Cascadia, we might get the magnitude 9 earthquake, we might get one eruption, but even if we did, we wouldn't have learned something societally useful before that magnitude 9 earthquake happened. And so if we're really going to help our domestic hazard situation, what we need to do is to look and gather data from the sped up system and supplement it with activities, with modeling, with data assimilation, so that we can use it in Cascadia and Alaska. So that is more or less what the report says. There's also a fair amount in there about how to organize coordination of science, how to build a center that can coordinate and bring synergies and collective impact. But I'd like to just pivot for a moment to contextualizing this implementation report within a timeline. This figure is not from the implementation report. This figure is from the RIG, the Research Infrastructure Guide from NSF, which is the guiding document for major instrumentation. And it's useful to realize where we are on this RIG diagram at the time of the release of the implementation report. The RIG points out that major research facilities generally develop for about 10 years in the scientific community before leaping into the design phase. The implementation report is likely the tail end of that development phase. And so we are working hard on moving into a place where we can actually design the infrastructure piece. That's typically a 3 to 5 year process. And then if all goes well, best case scenario, that would be 4 to 10 years of construction, followed by several decades of operation. So this is a long-term project. But if we're going to have it work, and we're going to really answer the questions and not just keep asking the same scientific questions, we need to get started now. So thank you very much, and I look forward to working with all of you.